All right, just getting the feed ready for Facebook. All right, everyone, we are on. Madam President, you could start us off.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our live streaming of our final program for the academic year 23-24. So excited that you're with us. I really want to thank you because this is the end of the semester and everybody's busy writing papers, grading papers, doing research, trying to get ready for graduation. So the fact that you stopped by our house tonight to talk, to speak, to learn, to engage together. It is just so thrilling, and we're so thankful for it. We have a wonderful guest whom Dr. Funday would going to introduce in a minute or so. But I just want to tell you she's the author of Snapping Beans, Voices of a Black Queer Lesbian in the South. The fact that we talking about snapping beans. I am so interested in that metaphor. I grew up in the South, so I know what it means to snap beans and what women used to do when they sat around on the porch snapping beans freshly from their garden. So I hope you send your questions. I hope you hang in here with us for about an hour. There will be time for some questions. And again, we appreciate you. We value you. We will not be who we are if you were not who you are. So thank you, and just sit back and get ready for a fantastic conversation that we're going to have about life in the South. Alicia, take it.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Again, I want to echo what Dr. Valerie Grimm has said. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And it is my pleasure, my honor. Every now and then we get to have conversations with people we know. And I am so proud to say that I have been knowing this sister for a very long time now. Maybe what, 15, 16 years now, if not longer. I first met Jamie in our master's program together. So this is the sister that we worked through a master's program together, a doctoral program together. And, I was talking to one of my grad students today about the importance of relationships in grad school because you never know who you will meet that will become an essential part of your life. And I am so proud of Jamie. And as soon as I heard that her book was going to be published, I said, you have to let NCBS be the first one to host your book talk. I said, you have to let us be the first. So, Jamie, thank you. And I would like to now introduce you all to someone who, yes, I'm going to say again, is very special to me. And I'm so happy for this sister. Dr. Jamie Canty, she, her, is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies and an iCubed affiliated scholar in the intersections in the lives of LGBTQIA plus persons core at Virginia Commonwealth University. She is an intersectional humanities scholar activist with a focus on the experiences of Black women and Black queer persons. She has published a book chapter based on her dissertation research titled The Swelling Wave of Oppression, an intersectional study to evaluate the health challenges of self identified Black queer women in the American South. Black Women and Public Health, Regenerative History, Practice, and Planning, Black Women's Wellness Book Series in 2021. She was also a contributor to African American activism and political engagement and Encyclopedia of Empowerment, writing about rape, the Black Church, and the Audre Lorde Project. She has presented at several conferences about her research, such as Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies South, National Council for Black Studies, and the National Women's Studies Association. In 2022, she was appointed as a board member of WGS South, working as the Black Indigenous Persons of Color Caucus Chair. Her current research chronicles the collective narrative of Southern Black queer lesbian women and gender nonconforming persons, uncovering how the American U.S. South, particularly the Christian Black Church, shapes and molds their lived experiences. Her forthcoming manuscript, which we'll be talking about tonight, titled Snapping Beans, Voices of a Black Queer Lesbian South, outlines the ways the South informs their intersectional identities. And without further ado, because I know you have a lot of information to share with us, Dr. Jamie Canty Williams, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I am truly honored to be first of all, let me thank you for extending this opportunity. When you came to see me in December, you were for real when you said you wanted me to be the first one. So you were certainly the first one. So thank you so much for providing me the place and space to talk about this book. It's been a labor of love, truly a labor, but I love nonetheless. So I'm really excited to talk to y'all about this book, what's contained. And if you stay till the end, if you are interested in pre-ordering the book, there is a discount code available. So I will have that available for y'all at the end of the talk today. All right, let me share my screen. Okay. Oh, let me make this bigger, lower. All right. Uh-oh. Now my computer wants to be slow. For the moment I start doing something. Okay, here we go. All right. I'm doing like I do when I'm in class, so please excuse me. Working on two screens. All right. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you, NCBS, for extending this invitation to me. I really appreciate it, and I'm humbled. Oftentimes, when we're writing, we kind of get put into our silos, and we forget that people actually need to hear the work that we're doing. So, hold on, let me put on my timer so I don't go too far. So this is the title and the cover of my forthcoming book entitled Snapping Beans, Voices of a Black Queer Lesbian South. As Alicia mentioned, Dr. Fatnet, like she mentioned, I'm assistant professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. And I came in as what they call an ICUBE scholar. So part of our job is to make sure that young faculty are given the opportunity to do community-based research with marginalized communities. So that's essentially what an IQ program is for. And the particular core I'm in is called the Intersections of the Lives of LGBTQIA persons. And so with that, I'm given the opportunity to study, do community-based research. And so the book came as an extension of that. So that's the cover, and it's given to us by Michaela Fields, who's a collage artist in Atlanta. She is amazing. So if we have time, I would love to talk more about the book cover and what it represents. But if we don't, then hit me up and we can have a conversation about it. All right. Ooh, where am I going? Okay. So what is snapping beans? Often I get this conversation because people often think I'm talking about shucking peas or snapping green beans, and I have to correct them. No, I mean snapping beans, right? There is a difference between snapping beans and shucking peas. So when I'm talking about snapping beans, I'm talking about the act of snapping. Hold on, let me put my timer. Just one moment. When I'm talking about snapping beans, I'm talking about the act of snapping the string green bean. So the bean is often represented of I guess, the size of the host shell. So for string beans, the host shell is much thinner and longer versus a pea, the host shell is thicker and the beans inside are bigger. So you can physically see the bean inside of a pea. But with beans, you don't see the peas necessarily inside the host bean. So oftentimes we have memories of this with grandma and them, literally, and I have that in my book, in that vernacular, grandma and them. We are often sitting at the kitchen table, outside on the porch, or in some intimate setting where we are literally snapping the bean. And oftentimes the freshness of the bean the fresher the bean, the sharper the snap. So, and also the top of it is connected to the bush or the pole in which the green bean was connected to. So often you remove that as well. So it's like a two-part process, but it almost becomes a rhythmic spiritual moment that you are hearing hearing snapping beans as there's things happening in the background. All right. So first, the thing to talk about, of course, one of the places that we're snapping beans is the Southern kitchen. I talk a lot about the Southern kitchen in the book, but I'll give you a little snippet of what I have in there. Hold on, if I can get my piece of paper. All right, I'll just do this. Okay. So in in the American South, the kitchen fed our bodies and our souls, planting the seed for our Southernness. The kitchen acted as our first classroom, an intergenerational space for us to learn from grandma and them. We heard stories about our families, communities, and ancestors. Preparing food gave us a chance to bond with our families while acting as the medium for transmitting knowledge from one generation to the next. Similar to other methods of food preparation, snapping beans, what Southern folks call snap beans, um, establishes dedicated time for granddaughters to sit and learn from grandma and them. And when I say grandma and them, this comes up a lot in the book. When I say grandma and them, those are the maternal figures. So I'm not just talking about grandma. It'd be grandma, auntie, godmama, cousin and them, community, the kin family member that's your auntie, but not really your auntie, your cousin, but not really your cousin. So that's encompassed when I'm talking about grandma and them, right? As we prepare an intimate family meal or a family feast, because Southern folks don't know how to just cook for one person. They cook for a whole family, right? Snapping green beans with grandma and them reconnects us to a Southern place and space where we engage in a Southern activity and hear grandma's narrative of the South. So the Southern kitchen, I frame it as a epistemological space and an intergenerational space. So it's a space where generations come together, and it's also a space of learning that you don't necessarily get within a academic classroom. Like I mentioned, it's our first classroom. But what does this mean for Southern Black queer folk, right? So what does the kitchen and snapping beans mean for Southern Black queer folk? As E. Patrick Johnson states, Southern Black queer folks are reared in the same country kitchens and on the same porches as our heterosexual siblings, cousins, and extended family. Black queer lesbians raised in the South, and even those who visited the South, are part of the Southern practice of snapping beans. We too are fixtures in these Southern kitchens and front porches. In those moments, we are not outsiders, but integral parts of a process to feed our families. Discussions of snapping beans uncover this multifaceted Southern reality for Southern Black, queer, lesbian, and gender nonconforming persons. And I'll explain why I have that as the title of the individuals that I'll explain that in a moment. We always existed in grandma's kitchen, soaking up the same lessons as our heterosexual cousins. While we are snapping green beans with grandma and them, we are snapping in silence, engaging in the Southern culture of silence and hiding our truth. Discussions of snapping beans uncovers the shame and condemnation rooted in the religiosity that permeates the South. The chore of snapping beans conjures up the trauma of being judged by the Southern Black community. Memories of snapping beans can also become a space of acceptance and belonging, where the act of snapping beans reconnects us to a Southern practice that bypasses any level of difference. While snapping beans, we felt like we were part of a Southern life, culture, and community. In this communal practice, we have a chance to be Southern and reconnect to our Southern roots. Snapping beans reminds us that the South provides a sense of nostalgia and peace, while also reminding us of the trauma experienced in the region. The act affirms our regional identity, invoking narratives of affirmation, reclamation, and ultimately, we take the lessons we learn while snapping beans and apply them to our Black queer communities. So, all that to say, these things, essentially, that snapping beans connects this population, Southern Black, queer, lesbian, for women and persons, to the South itself. In my conversations with the people that I interviewed, whom I call interlockers, because these were individuals with whom I was in a conversation with. These were not individuals with whom I was interviewing in a formal, like, social science sense. Because I was sharing my information, they were sharing information with me. It was a mutuality of learning. So as I was having conversations with them, I would ask them about their memories of snapping beans and what it invokes for them. And so one of the things that's very important is the fact that it connects them to the South. Even if they felt disconnected from the South because of their sexualities, they felt connected to the South in the memories of snapping beans. They remembered, oh yeah, I was part of a Southern practice, right? Another thing that it did, and then in that discussion, I go a lot into metrocism, right? Where oftentimes when we think of a landscape, we think of a rural landscape as backward and a urban landscape as moving forward, and how there's kind of this negotiation with those things for these people. And also the fact of connecting them to the process of picking the green bean, canning the green bean, which was the part I wasn't expecting, actually. I was expecting talking about the snapping the beans and the cooking, but I didn't expect to talk about the canning. part, which is so Southern, right? Because when you think about the South, you think about those mason jars that grandma would make, you know, they would hold things in to preserve them because you never know when things are out of season and you want something, that sort of thing. So it was a method of preserving food. So it connects them to the South. Another thing is that it connects when they were snapping beans with grandma and them, it connected them to, or they saw grandma in their element. Grandma and them were intimate with one another, with other Black women. So it was a time to see kind of like a Black women's circle in a way, where they were able to be intimate, be vulnerable outside the watchful eyes of men specifically. And they were able to be authentic. And so it really established the first time where the Southern Black female community was with one another and they were able to share stories and be their authentic selves, which is essential to queerness in a sense, right? And I talk about like sharing in the vernacular. So I bring in Black feminists, the Combahee River Collective, as well as the vernacular given to us by womanism. Another thing that it did was establish a methodology that, and ironically enough, I didn't realize it was going to be a methodology, but it ended up being that because grandma and them could easily, cut the heads off, right, of the green bean. But what they do is they force you to sit down and snap beans with them, right? So there is the act of snapping beans necessitates the transmission of oral histories. So, what I found in my conversations with these individuals was that we were engaged in a process of snapping beans without the green bean. We were sharing and collecting I was essentially collecting oral narratives from these interlockers in a way that connect them to their Southernness and reminded them of their Southernness. And that's in the opening up conversations about the healing and the hurting and the healing that takes place in the South. All right, so what is the purpose of this text? I'll tell you. All right, so the purpose of this text is to chronicle the coming out narratives of Southern Black, queer, lesbian women, and gender nonconforming persons by centering the South as the main character in this narrative. I uncover how the intersections of race, gender fluidity, and sexuality create a distinct but polyphonic Southern narrative. I found a new word and I added it in there. I thought it would sounded nice. um, this work paints a new Southern landscape that integrates stories of hurt, healing, and reconciliation. It serves as the Southern kitchen or the front porch, documenting the process from regional trauma to wholeness and reconciliation rooted in a Southern practice. The work provides a trajectory of how the silent Southern Black queer lesbian girl, snapping beans in grandma's kitchen, establishes a Black queer lesbian South for her to exist and thrive in. The Southern Black queer lesbian woman has a story to tell. This work adopts the practice of snapping beans with grandma and them as an opportunity to slow down and hear a new Southern narrative. So essentially what I was trying to do was to provide a journey or chronicle a collective narrative of that silent queer Black girl who's snapping beans in grandma's kitchen and what she would say if she was sharing her narratives with grandma and them while snapping beans. All of these quotes came directly from my interlockers. These were the quotes that just stuck out to me that really personified everything else that was happening in that chapter. So the first one, after this introduction chapter, you have the chapter, I was silent, but my brain was loud. So we talk about the silent South. And let me back up and say these are vantage points of the South given to us by the Southern um, the silent Black queer lesbian girl, right? These are kind of the narratives or the vantage points of the South. Because, like I said, I wanted the South to be central within this text. And in that, I'm providing the vantage point of how this girl goes from hurting and trauma to reaching healing and reconciliation. So that was the first part. First, we talk about the silent South. Then we talk about the church. Interestingly enough, when I started writing this, I thought I was going to talk about social, economic, and political. I thought I was going to tie all those things together. However, as I interviewed probably on my third conversation, I realized I have to talk about the church. It has to be central. It has to be central to this narrative because I'm talking to Southern Black women, and Black persons. So I have to talk about the church because it's so pivotal to our coming out narrative, right? So the church, so this talks about the church, the shameful and condemning South. The church is not the building, it's the people. So there I chronicle the hurt and pain that comes from not just the preacher having the homophobic sermon, but the homophobia and heterosexism that we hear from our mothers and family members, that people that we love, right? That kind of wield those weapons of shame against us. And like one of my interlocutors said, they said that, shame is the currency of the church. So I kind of, point, I, I will count the currency of the church in this chapter. But ultimately, the condemning South talks about how that shame becomes internalized, how, and this is part of what people would name, I guess, the closeted moment, right? But instead of it being a closet, it becomes a weight. I talk about that a little bit, but I talk about the condemning South as this, where these individuals kind of internalize hatred for themselves. And then in that hatred for themselves, they start to see themselves as a problem, and that being manifested in very harmful ways. Then, of course, an extension of that, you have the church, you have grandma and them, right? Who you were once snapping beans with are now the ones who are perpetuating church shame on you. But you also have that the heterosexuality that comes out from it, or heterosexism that comes. So this is where I talk about the judgmental South and the Southern Black personality. And really the Southern Black personality talks about the person who judges anybody who steps outside of heteronormativity. So the individual who will judge somebody. So in there, I actually frame heteronormativity, heterosexism, and heteropatriarchy. So how the church infiltrates into the community, how it impacts how people judge one another, and how that impacts that silent Black queer lesbian girl. Then, of course, she finds her truth, right? And that's when they got to the chapter, I'm Standing in My Truth. So here I uncover how that girl comes out of that duality that comes in the condemning South, how she decides to live her truth. And part of that I talk about a lot related to love, self-love, love for community, and love for the South, as well as the way in which they reconcile with the church and outlining that. And then ultimately talking about this thing called the Black queer lesbian South, which is where this silent Black queer lesbian girl not only can exist in the South, but thrive. So I know it took us for a while to get there, but now we have a little bit of background to set the scene for it, because I think it's good to just know who I was talking to and who I was in conversation with. So a little background about the population. So I was in conversation with, like I mentioned, their interlocutors in this work, but they were self-identified queer lesbian women and gender nonconforming persons living in or from the American South. I was very intentional about making sure I put queer lesbian in there. I did it for several reasons. So first, what I found when I did my mixed method approach, I sent the survey out thinking that many of my interlocutors were going to say, I identify as queer. But when I received the results, I saw that 55% of my interlocutors identified as lesbian, which blew my mind, right? I said, oh, okay. So, and then 20% identify as queer. So what that got me thinking is that I did not want to limit them naming themselves as lesbian. I didn't want to gloss that over by saying, oh, they're just queer. No, right? Because it's a very intentional act for a Southern Black woman to identify themselves as lesbian. And I didn't want to take that away. So that was one reason. Another reason was that I wanted to make sure that Black queer studies was intentional about making sure we are always including lesbian in the scholarship. So that's another reason why I included lesbian with this population. And also based on this coming out narrative, identifying yourself as lesbian is a process, and I didn't want to take that process away from those individuals who identified as lesbian, right? So that really goes to show us that location, time, and place often dictates how one identifies themselves. And then, of course, I had 20% who identified as gender nonconforming. The rest of them identified as being themselves as woman. And so because of that, I included gender nonconforming in the title. So the South is when it became interesting, because people were interested in participating, but they were like, well, I'm from Texas, but now I live I had someone who was from Texas but live in Boston. I was like, you can still participate. One person, oh, I used to live in Louisiana, but now I'm in Northern California. You can participate. I had somebody who was from Ohio who's lived in Atlanta who was like, I want to participate. And I'm like, come on, right? So I looked at the three different categories. One, individuals who were born and raised in the South and currently reside, obviously. Those born outside of the South but lived in the South for at least 10 years. I hear myself in another room, so that's why I paused. Right. Third, born and raised in the South but currently live in another region, another American region. So those are the three categories I looked into whenever I was fitting into those categories. So I did have 19% that were born outside of the South that came to the South and still identified as Southern. So this whole notion of being Southern and what that means and what that looks like really expanded my understanding of the South. But as a result, I decided to label these individuals Southern, Black, queer, lesbian, and gender nonconforming person. So in the text, you will just see it referred to in this acronym, just to save space. So this is me as a little girl in a Southern landscape. I was a cheerleader at one time, believe it or not. This was me as a cheerleader in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And I put this picture because I want people to know that this is not just this is an autoethnographic piece. All right. So this research employs an autoethnographic method, uncovering how experience is heard by other Southern Black, queer, lesbian, and gender nonconforming persons mirror my own. In the academy, we're often guilty of trying to research a subject that is outside of our home to appear objective and therefore validate our research. Yet I find many humanities scholars, specifically in gender and ethnic studies, often research a topic close to us to make sense of our experiences. We understand that the personal is political. Whatever challenges or questions that arise in our lives or communities are often represent larger systems of oppression. How can we study those external factors without first making sense of what took place at home? Right? I need to know what happened at my home, right? Our spark for our subject or theory is often rooted in trying to find answers to problems or questions we have within our own lives. We are trying to make sense of our own experiences and connect to our communities. When when I speak of this population, and I put the acronym in there, when I speak of this population, I'm speaking on behalf of a community that I also represent in my position as a Black or lesbian woman born and raised in the South, socialized by the Southern Christian Black Church, i.e., AME. This work examines the I and we simultaneously as I chronicle our journey to actualization and reconciliation. I was very intentional about making sure when I was going through my edits, making sure that I had the I, the we, the R, us, right? To let the reader know that I am identifying part of this population, right? So by uncovering their stories and what it means to reach wholeness, I'm also sharing my story. I chronicle our collective narrative, piecing together and documenting the stories of hurt and joy we have with the South. So this is part of, again, why I decided to do an autoethnographic study. And I go a little bit in terms of how other folks, when they study this population, they focus on the context of, an ethnographic study. So I go into that a little bit. So how did I conceptualize the South? This has been a journey, right? In terms of how did I conceptualize the South in this work? So one of the ways in which this just documents kind of my journey. So when I first started thinking about the South, I thought about it in the context of the US Census. It was easy, right? Oh, the US Census says it's the South. That's how I'm defining the South. But then it went from, well, am I talking about the US South or the American South? And so this is a section that kind of goes into why I decided to focus on the American South. Making Southern and the South a proper noun signifies a certain type of American experience related to a specific cultural reality. Unlike phrases like US South, the American South represents a specific cultural geographic experience that fits in the context of what we broadly define as American. The US is political, referred to a restrictive boundary established and reinforced by enslavement, the American Civil War, political representation, and methods of economic production. Shifting from the US South to the American South compels Southern scholars to rethink social cultural context in defining the location. Defining the South as as a cultural space is timeless and not restricted by rigid boundaries. Including America helps Southern scholars and researchers alike to reconsider what it means to be American and who has the authority to dictate what is and what is not American. Although framing the American South as a social cultural discussion can be subjective, rooted in the individual experiences that people have in this region, it is also defined by what individuals consider American and how the South differs from and aligns with their versions of America. The American, and so I won't go too much into what other folks said, but essentially I was looking at the South I decided to use the American South as a social cultural space with multiple histories and multiple cultural realities. So then I went into what McKittrick goes into in Demonic Grounds when she goes into traditional geography, racialized geography, and a racialized sexual geography. And in that, um, traditional geography aligns very similar to that of the US Census. It's very sterile, right? But then in political, rooted in European heteronormative kind of framing, right? But McKittrick gets us to see the racialized geography really shows how Black folks decide to take up space in a particular geography. How do they define themselves based on where they are situated geographically? How do they define themselves in that place and space? Then she goes into how do Black women in the racialized sexual geography, how do Black women essentially claim place and space in the South as well, right? Well, not in the South specifically, I'm sorry. How do they claim place and space in a particular location? Well, I said, well, the question becomes, and that goes to my racialized sexual queer geography, is I was questioning how does queerness show up based on location, right? So I included a racialized sexual queer geography. So because even when McKittrick talks about the racialized sexual geography, she's talking about cis het Black women, right? And how they claim place and space. But I wanted to know how do Black queer folk, how do Black queer women create place and space? So how does queerness show up in this racialized sexual geography? Black queerness and queer embodiment expands this racialized sexual history of the South. Because of our Black queer identities, this population creates historical geographies in the South that may align with and vary from their racialized historical geographies. In these discussions about difference in the South, this population exposes how cultural landscape does not only rely on does not rely on a heteronormative narrative. I'm sorry. We exist in a myriad of Southern experiences with distinct racial, queer, and sexual components. Because of these overlapping identities, we define the South from various vantage points rooted in a queer, racialized, gendered, and sexual geography. So this population expands on this Southern traditional geography to include a potentially new cultural geographic landscape, a racialized sexual queer geography that's inclusive of sexuality and queerness. This racialized sexual queer geography, one, represents the ways queerness and queer embodiment manifest in a specific geographic location, and two, provides an intersectional framework that directly challenges this Southern traditional geography. So that's essentially framing how I envision this racialized sexual geography. So I have certain elements that I expose about this particular geography. So first, looking at it from the vantage point of a racialized sexual geography and this notion of home place. So how does the South represent a home place for Black queer women and gender nonconforming persons? And in that, I kind of play with this idea of the South being a Black woman and how for us it's like returning back to mother, grandma and them, right? That was actually a suggestion given to me by a colleague. Shout out to Dr. Johnson who gave me that suggestion. It was really, really good. And so also this idea of naming and renaming, again, like I mentioned in the beginning, how location often changes and challenges how one identifies themselves as lesbian, queer, or both. So going into that, also, this Pat Hill Collins's notion of outsider within and Carlos Du's notion of the insider outsider positionality, and how being an outsider often informs how you see yourself in a particular place and space. while Pat Hill Collins goes primarily into the intra-racial kind of conversation, I'm arguing or trying to figure out how this positionality exists when you are part of a marginalized community. So how do we exist as outsiders within the Southern Black community, right? And of course, discussions of queer given to us by E. Patrick Johnson, where he integrates Southernness and how our queerness is often understood by our Southernness. So the Christian Black Church, whew, I always like to tell people that part of the research that I do has to center on the South because, again, the South, I mean, I'm sorry, not the South, the church, because the church and the South have such an intimate relationship. And so these are the denominations of the individuals in which I interviewed. Had conversations with. I had conversations with persons who were part of the Baptist, Methodist, United Methodist, AME, so it was nice to talk to somebody else who was AME. That was kind of cool. Holiness, Church of God in Christ. I did talk to someone who was a former Kojic. That was interesting, right? Jehovah's Witnesses. Those were probably the most traumatic coming out narratives that I've heard, because Jehovah's Witness faiths it's so fundamental, that it was really hard to listen to those narratives, and also, of course, non-denominational. So of course, the Christian Black Church, I had to talk about it intimately because essentially, in order to understand the scholarship related to Black queer folks in the South, you have to look at how they are impacted by the church. There's so many works that talk about the church in relation to this population, because the church is not only a spiritual institution, it's also a secular one. It's also one in which we learn about morality and hierarchy and what does it mean to be a Black person in America, right? It's literally, as Lincoln and Mamaya mentioned, it's literally the wound of the Black community. So, but in the South, it's so much connected to secular life. You see the church in all walk. You can't really separate, right? It's much interwoven into Southern life. Example of it, this is actually a picture of my family church in Sumter, South Carolina, Tiverton Baptist Church. And I use this as an example because, like many Southern Black folk, our histories with the South are connected to the churches, right? Our family legacies are connected to churches, as mine is with this particular church. So how does this relate to Black queer folk, right? So first of all, the church dictates Southern living, like I mentioned, connected to our Southernness. So our Southernness is informed by the church. And it was also it also socializes or indoctrinates a lot of Southerners in terms of normalcies related to gender and sexuality. It dictates what you can and cannot do, what girls should or should not be able to do, and that sort of thing. It also goes into the rise of Black conservatism and the connection to the Southern Black personality, heterosexism, heteronormativity, and heteropatriarchy. And I specifically say Black heteropatriarchy, not just heteropatriarchy, right? Because it's a different type of weapon used against Black lesbians and Black queer lesbians. And of course, it's the first institution when we encounter homophobic and heterosexist messaging, like hate the sin, love the sinner. And I walk that through in my shame and condemnation chapter, because again, shame is the currency of church. Church has the currency of shame. So it's shaming its parishioners to align with what they think is holy and righteous. But in doing that, you are minimizing one's ability to explore who they are, right? So yeah. All right, so quickly, my hope for the readers, I am going to skip to that section if I can just get from all these papers. So that way we can have question and answers, right? So I would love to have a conversation. Ooh. All right, I hope that you, the reader, sees this book as a testimony of love, self-love, communal love, and love of the South. But with any kind of love, there's pain, beauty, accountability, and vulnerability. With love comes truth, a truth that's often suppressed and silenced by others. But I want our truths to free somebody from the shackles of shame, silence, and condemnation. I want the truth of this book to provide someone a hug and a few words of affirmation. You don't have to come out to the world, but I pray that this book helps you to find ways to authentically live in your truth so you can so you can be free and organically love yourself, your community, and your Southern roots. I hope the reader who finds themselves in a dark place knows that they are not alone. Let this book be your support and guide, affirming you that you are not alone and that your journey is not in vain. I hope that the readers receive a new narrative I hope the reader receives a new narrative of the Black South, one that is filled with complexities, contradictions, joys, pains, and freedoms that exist in a seemingly contentious region. I hope the reader realizes in this journey that the Black South does not solely belong to Southern Black heterosexual folk. I want the reader to know that the Black South is diverse with many colors and layers. There are so many ways one can exist and thrive in the Black South. I want the reader to get a glimpse into that world we rarely see. This book provides visibility of Southern Black queer folks, maybe not all queer folk, no, maybe not all queer or LGBTQIA identified persons, but at least for one segment of the community that is hidden among the letters of our sexual identity. This book is for all the sons and daughters, and yes, I put daughters, right, in Southern vernacular. And I actually had a footnote that it's in Southern vernacular. For all the sons and daughters of the South, regardless of our own personal identity markers. I hope you find yourself in this book, so you know the significance of your story of the South. No matter how far we remove ourselves from the South, I hope this book reminds you that the South is woven into your being. Instead of carrying with shame, let it be a marker of pride. For those who daily encounter this complex Black South, I also hope you find part of your story in this book. For my Southern sisters, both queer and straight, I hope this work helps you to realize that we all deal with the same societal oppressions, even if they manifest differently for Southern Black queer lesbians. In all our lives, we had to unlearn some toxic gender norms that kept us suppressed for generations. For many, for my Southern brothers, both queer and straight, I hope you gain some perspective about how these toxic gender norms we value also impact you. I hope these words help you to unlearn some generational norms related to masculinity. Let me go down. Let me go down. Okay, let me just skip to this last one. For this book is for all those Southern Black queer lesbian women and gender nonconforming persons who, for several reasons, had to remain silent about who they are. This book is for those Southern Black queer ancestors who did not or could not exist in their truth out of fear of being silenced by violence, shame, condemnation, and heteronormativity. This book is intended to the women and persons who could not speak or live in their truths. I know Southern Black queer ancestors existed long before I even considered writing this book. Black queer folks have always lived in the South and found ways to thrive, but our stories were overlooked and silenced. With this book, folks get a glimpse into our world. I invite you all to sit down at the kitchen table, snap beans with us, and listen to our journey to wholeness. Thank you so much. Like I mentioned, if you are interested, I will put the link in the chat whenever we're doing Q&A, but that and also the discount code. So if you're interested in either if you want to take a snapshot of this or I can just put it in the chat, then we can get to crack-a-lackin'. But thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to any questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Jamie. When you said we could get to crack-a-lackin', I thought you was gonna say so we could get to snapping.
That would have been good. That would have been good.
So we could get to snapping. Please take a water break if you don't mind. If you have a bottle of water by you, you've been talking a while, and I
have
appreciate
been.
you
I
because I
have
know
been.
you. Yes. So sip your water break. I did see your wife put in the chat water break before question. So I want to make sure I honor the missus. She said she need a water break.
She's always looking out for me.
Yeah, so we do have questions and comments. And of course I will table my questions, but I want to first open the floor to our president to see if she had any comments or questions before we got into the audience's Q&A.
So Jamie, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I'm a Southerner by birth, and I grew up in Mississippi. I grew up on my parents have a farm, and so I grew up with garden stories, and we had a huge garden. So as I was listening to you do your presentation, I was actually thinking about the life of the communities of people you met through the life of a bean, a snap bean. Although I know you talk about the snapping beans as a moment where people had space to be who they wanted to be. But I kind of thought about the being itself and what happens to the being in a metaphoric kind of way. And that I saw the being sort of in its wholeness when you get it out of the garden. But I also know that in order for it to become a snap bean, you're breaking it, you're snapping it. And so in so many ways you're separating the being from its core existence. And at the same time, what it reminded me of is that
I'm going Dr. Grimm.
you break the beam in order to create a community. So as you snap, you breaking them apart, and when you put them in the pot, you put them in a pot for a purpose, and the purpose is to provide nutrition for the people who are hungry and who need to eat. So I thought about the communities that you were speaking about in terms of queer community, and how much that being is similar to, in many ways, what has happened to people who are forced to live on the margins, that they are broken and eaten in ways to sustain the hegemonic system that we have in place in order to provide, in order for them to maintain their system of power and dominance. And so the snap being, like the queer community that you're talking about, have been forced to serve a purpose. And that purpose is to be utilized and to be pushed down so that those who are hungry for whatever they are hungry for can benefit from it. And then I thought about what happens.
That's a word, Doc.
What, huh?
I said, that's a word, Doc.
She writing the appendix.
So what happens to the snap bean? What makes the snap bean fight back? And I'll close with this. The snap bean fight back just like oppressed people do. And in this context, you're talking about the queer community. Although the bean is broken and somewhat destroyed because it's eaten and utilized by folks who need nutrition, the value of the bean is its seed. And so what makes the bean so significant is that it gets to live again, because the seed provides the purpose for the life. And I think what you have provided for us are ways we can think about how people who've been pressed down can have found ways to live and to live again. And that the snap bean space provides that moment for that to happen. And so that's how I heard your story, through the life of a snap bean.
I love that. I love that. And I think going to that analogy in terms of having to be broken, but even being broken, because, Southern Black folk, whenever we create green beans, we don't just like saute them or nothing like that. We are putting them in a stew. So we're making it better. We're breaking it, putting it under heat, which is what I'm talking about with the trauma of the South, and making it better. Right? Making it stronger. And in that, we create something beautiful in the brokenness. And that's what I think the Black queer lesbian South does, is it creates something beautiful from the heat and the brokenness that was experienced by being marginalized in the South. So I love that. Oh, I love that. You want to write that in appendix?
I love when Dr. Grimm, didn't I say that before we went live, y'all? I said, I love when Valerie do what she do, and she did it. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So we do have some Q&A, some questions here, and some comments. Okay. So Jacqueline Barnes, were you talking to the interviewees about how they connect to their faith post-trauma? And did many of them opt to leave or stay with the religion that harmed them growing up?
That's a good question. Yes, absolutely. So there was a few things that happened in the reconciliation process in terms of spirituality. So some of them would disconnect from the church altogether and be like, nope, not doing it, right? Some of them would connect to more queer affirming church or queer affirming sub denominations, right? So whether it's Pentecostal, that might have more queer affirming subsets of it. And then they might also connect to more African spirituality, right? But either way, in all of those ways, they still are connecting to a spiritual thing. They were able to separate the spiritual from the faith based, right? They were able to, and I really lay this out, how we got lessons of faith growing up, in Sunday school and things, with Hebrews 11:1, faith is the substance of things hoped for and evidence of things not seen. They literally are the epitome of that. Um, so yeah, they're literally the epitome of that. So with this faith-based conversation, but they take it as a way of, okay, I don't want to necessarily get with the institution that has traumatized me, but I want to get with the spiritual aspects that I actually like from the church, because many of the people that I interviewed were actually very active in their churches, were active, currently active. Some were preachers and priests and of their own right. So there was still this still this desire to connect to the spiritual element of the church without necessarily the offensive nature of the church itself.
All right. Thank you so much. The next question is from Dominique X, who is actually a graduate student here at UD. And Dom asks, have you seen these Southern Black queer lesbian experiences affected by beauty standards such as colorism, ableism, fat phobia, etc., informing, encountering, and developing identities?
Absolutely. So in queerness, a lot of what happens, and this is part of, I need to flesh this out in another project, not in this one. This one's done. Another project, I'm thinking about fleshing this out. But the ways in which we conceptualize what queer is, I think, has been watered down. And in queer studies, and particularly in talking about like LGBTQIA identities, a lot of it was revolutionary. And it wasn't just about sexuality per se, it was a way of challenging societal structures and whatever that might be, right? So some of it might be queerness became a conscious raising activity. So it's not just about, okay, I want to enter into this world in a certain way, but was also, I want to challenge fat phobia. I want to challenge ableism. I want to challenge, African diaspora. I want to not challenge it, but I want to enhance African diasporic identities, and amalgamation of things, right? That they actually wanted to challenge, and queerness became the entryway to do that. So absolutely, that came up in some of my conversations with interlockers. Absolutely. Bless you.
All right. Next question from Esther Canty Barnes. I
Oh, Auntie.
I am glad you talk about the church in your book. How would you recommend that the church support the LGBTQA plus population, especially young men and women who are in this population? How can we educate ourselves about this issue?
Oh, that's such a good question. Leave it up to my aunt to give me that question. I was like, ooh. I think that there needs to be space where queer folks feel, where people in the LGBT community feel not only seen but affirmed. Because I think often what churches may do is tolerate queer folk and not necessarily, and may even accept queer folk, but not necessarily affirm. So I think if there are ways in which and it has to come from leadership, right? Or from someone that is seen, to be heard and to be seen. So, prime example, the church that me and Ebony attend to in Atlanta, the pastor at one point literally did a whole sermon about the fact that he supported the church accepting LGBTQIA persons in leadership and in the church itself. So I think that that affirmation was really, I literally cried that whole sermon because it was just the first time that I felt affirmed in that space. And another thing in terms of seeing leadership, right? Seeing leadership that are actually queer affirming folks, I think is helpful as well, if not queer themselves. So I think those two things might be really helpful.
All right, our next question is from Jacqueline Barnes. Did you explore the inherent queerness of snapping beans as a woman-centered practice to our Black grandmothers and aunties in your work?
Absolutely. And I want to explore that a little bit more, that and I didn't get a chance to go into it as much, but when I'm talking about authenticity and vulnerability, that was something that grandma and them gave us. Now, they may have not been able to tell us how to be queer, right? And how to navigate as being a queer person. But kind of what Dr. Grimm was talking about is that they gave us the tools for resistance. And they gave us a place and a space for us to have these conversations and to live in our truth in a way, and whatever that means, whatever that looks like. We just took it to we just repackaged it and made it into something else. But I do think that they gave us essentially a queer framing without realizing that they were doing it. Absolutely.
Okay. How many people were interviewed for this research and how did you select the participants?
Ooh, good. And I know that was from Dr. Barnes.
Yes, yes, Claude Barnes, yes.
Oh, let me just say, Dr. Barnes, if it was not for Dr. Barnes, I would not be at Clark Atlanta University. I would not have went to Clark Atlanta. So shout out to Dr. Barnes. Um, but I interviewed 39 persons, women and persons. I selected, well, first I did it through, I had to do an IRB. That was not fun, but I had to do an IRB through VCU. And through that, I created a website and created actually my Instagram and all these different social media ways for people to get in contact with me. And also, surprisingly, word of mouth. So once a few people I started interviewing a few people. It was just a flood. So it was almost a snowball effect that happened, which usually happens with marginalized communities in this way. So I just started getting requests to, hey, I want to interview you. Hey, I'd like to interview, but I have a question. And so that's when I had to start really being intentional about, oh, I need to define how I'm looking at living in or from the South. I have to be intentional about, like, even when someone asked me, well, I want to be in your research, but I'm lesbian, I'm not queer. And I was like, you know, okay, I have to rethink this a little bit more. So after that, I sent what did I send? Oh, I sent a Google form because I love Google Forms. I sent a survey out to the individuals who were interested and started populating their responses, giving them pseudonyms, giving them participant codes. And at the end, I asked if they don't mind me interviewing them. And so we did do interviews. Shout out to Zoom for allowing me to interview all these individuals. Some I interviewed on the phone. They preferred to talk on the phone, which was fine. And some did Zoom, some were in person, but like social distancing kind of things. But that was, yeah, basically how I did it.
Okay, and we do have uh, two more questions. So, and the next question is from Jonathan Grant, and he actually goes into a question I had
Right.
kind of, not put it together, but something that I've noticed and as reading your abstract was that you present the South not so much, yes, as a region, but also as a character, right? As this entity and being that has an acting part and
Mhm.
role. So Jonathan's question is, well, first he states, thank you for this important work in giving voice to a beautiful and resilient population. I love how you center the South as this region is largely overlooked in the humanities and my discipline of sociology. I am
Mhm.
curious to know if and how you present a nuanced Southern experience. There are numerous Souths like Marcus Hunter and Zandria Robinson says in the book Chocolate Cities. In other words, the deep South, down South, urban South, rural South, the Geechee Gula South, etc. How do you deal with these various Souths and show the similarities and differences of these Souths in these women's stories?
Ooh, give it
Mm,
to Dr. Grant to give you that question that just blows you away. All right, Dr. Grant. I love the work that he does. So I do believe that I wasn't able to really go into okay, let me back up. I was. So when these interlocutors are talking about the South and how they define the South, I was really pulling out the characteristics of the South based on what was given to me. So there was this negotiation with the rural South, and like you kind of mentioned, the rural South and this like urban South, and how an urban South allowed for Southern queerness to really be actualized. It was more safe, right? So the Atlantas, the Richmonds, the Baton Rouges, the New Orleans, these kind of, I know I didn't say that right, Alicia, don't come for me. But that is not how you say it, right? But all of these different urban Southern locations that allow Black queer folks to be to be affirmed, right? Because that's often what happens. But then there is this negotiation with, well, I'm from the South, but I'm not a country girl, or I'm from the South, but I'm a Southern belle, you know? So it's like negotiating with these identities of the South in a way. So that comes up a lot in those, not the specific ones you mentioned, but definitely the ones in terms of what came from the South, and how do they see themselves as Southern persons, right? So the South becomes a central character, and in it, it almost becomes an identity all in itself. And so, what are the parts of that identity? So, I talked in one chapter about the Southern hospitality and how that impacts, particularly Southern queer women, because we're more likely to engage in this notion of Southern hospitality. And how does that, in order to make others comfortable, we are uncomfortable, right? Talking about the don't ask, don't tell societal policy, the slave mentality, the Southern mentality. So I was really painting, and even the Black Southern personality of the Southern Black personality being this person who is the holder of all things heteronormative and heteropatriarchal, like the social surveillance, right? That person who's gossiping about sister so and so being with sister so and so, or, oh, did you hear Deacon was with that boy? You know, that kind of thing. And so I do bring out more personality traits, right, of the South, and how it shows up in both urban and rural spaces. I don't know if that really answers fully the question. I feel like I'm missing.
Yeah.
But Grant, holla at me. We'll talk.
And even with what you just said, it makes me think about the intersectional existence just within that, right? Like how those of us from the South, we tend to be fluid in the various, types of Southern identities that was mentioned, right?
Hmm.
You can go from Southern Belle to being a country girl to be, it's like we kind of speak a certain language, based on where we are in the South. So, I definitely would like to continue having that particular
Well,
conversation
one
with.
of the things that comes up, I forgot to mention this in my presentation, but one of the things that come up in the book, I bring in tropes. So a lot of the discussions of the South bring in Southern tropes. So I go into the nuances of the Southern Belle. When we think about the South, we think about the Southern Belle like Scarlett O'Hara. We think about the good old boy. We think about, good old boy or Bubba. And we think about the shoot Southern gentleman, and all these kind of things. James T. Sears wrote this text, Coming of Age in the South.
Mm,
He really goes through all of those different tropes. The cover of the book is kind of controversial because it's literally the Confederate flag. So it's really interesting, but nonetheless. So he goes through different things like the Oreo, he says nigger, the nigga, the Oreo, the trailer park trash. And that's an interesting one too, because particularly as it relates to white lesbianism,
mhm,
because he argues that it's almost as if a Southern white woman who is, Dominique, it's called Coming of Age. I think it's called Coming of Age in the James T. Sears is his name.
okay.
James T. Sears is the name of the author. I
I'll
can't
connect
remember.
you with Dom after.
Yeah. So he brings up all these different tropes of the South, and he argues like, Southern, it's okay. Southern white women who don't adopt the Southern belle trope are automatically deemed as white trash and automatically deemed as sexually promiscuous, and therefore them being lesbian is not such a far-fetched thing, right? So he definitely ties those things together in terms of how race and class specifically come together to amplify these tropes. So, and then of course, talking about the Black South specifically, when I talk about heteronormativity, I talk about these tropes and these gender binaries that exist in the Black South. With pastor, first lady, that came up a lot. How pastor and first lady are not only those cisgender norms, right? That we've been socialized to understand about, Black cisgender identity, but also Robert Boylorn brings in the good girl, the in-between girl, and the bad girl, right? So all of these different levels of what this looks like in the South. So I think it does come up in many of those tropes, the ways in which we negotiate with these identities. I end up actually having a great time creating additional tropes in the Black queer lesbian South. I create the Southern Belle, the Southern film, the Southern film, the Southern gentle lady, the Southern good old boy with an I, right? And the good old, and those are like, yeah, the good old boy, because in the South, Southern Black queer folk, well, if they identify as boys, it'll be BOI, right? Or studs. Um, so I kind of play with that. And then also the gender nonconforming person. So I kind of play with those tropes a little bit. So that was really fun to do that for the Black queer lesbian South.
Thank you. And we just have two more questions left. And I have a good former colleague I used to work with. She calls herself a gentle lady. So when you said that, that made me smile. I thought about her. All
Yeah.
right, Dr. Larry Miles is
Oh,
his next
Dr.
question. I actually love his question because it's current with popular culture.
Right.
Dr. Canty Williams, what is your opinion on the rumors of queer-leaning behaviors of some of the mega church pastors and how the Black community has been
Mm.
responding to those rumors? Dr. Miles, you went there, Dr. Miles, so let's go.
Gender bending. Is that what?
Yeah.
Uh, so one of the things, so that comes up in there. So one of the things that comes up in the book that I mention is the fact that there are so many rumors about that. And that really brings up the hypocrisy of the church. And that's one of the things that the interlockers mention a lot, right? About the hypocrisy of the Black church and how, oh, pastor can do certain things, but a woman doing certain things, it's seen a certain way, whether straight or gay, a woman can't do a certain things, but oh, pastor could be out here with deacon deacon so and so with the organist or whatever the case might be. But I really, it was so funny. So it's two things. One, there is this idea that patriarchy still protects them, right? I talk about it as inherent, no, heterosexist permission, right? The fact that, and that was actually given to me by one of my interlocutors. I said, real good, right? That they're given permission to do certain things that they, because of their heterosexuality and their cisgender identity, they're kind of able to get away with some things, right? And patriarchy. And another part about it is their autonomy, that they're able to kind of engage in these sexual acts because they have the autonomy to do so, right? They have the freedom to do so because, no one's got their sexuality or sexual improprieties are individual, but a woman's sexual improprieties and a queer woman's sexual improprieties, right, are viewed as communal shame. Right? You are the wound of the Black community. Therefore, if you do not produce children or do not get with a heterosexual man, you are contributing to the death of the race. So there's a level of shame given to Black women doing certain things that is not necessarily given to the deacons and them and the pastors, because they're kind of given, and because pastor is second to God, you're almost giving him that permission because, oh, he's still a godly man. And as long as he still can perform heteronormativity as he needs to, then he's able to do what he wants to do behind closed doors. We give him that permission. As a congregation, as parishioners, as Southern folk, we give them that permission.
All right. And our last question from Kimberly Kinsler. Often one research topic begets another one. What other topics were born out of this project? What's next for you?
People always want what's next. So I really want to go into this Black queer lesbian South more, right? Yeah, I definitely want to break. But I'm so excited because I'm trying to stop myself from jumping into my next project. I'm really trying to stop myself. I'm like, no, Jamie, the book's not even out yet, and you're trying to go to your next project. What I would love to do is get some grant money, obviously, right? So I can really create this Black queer lesbian South. I'm having to decide, or not even create it, uncover it. Because what I would like to do is let folks know about the history of the Black queer lesbian South. In other words, Black queer folks have always existed here. So uncovering research about like Venus magazines and the contributions that they made to Southern life and to Black queer culture. And also what is being done currently. So like past, present, and future of Black queer lesbian South and what that means and what that looks like. I don't know if it's going to be in the form of a podcast. I don't know if it's going to be in the form of a website. I don't know if it's going to be in the form of another book. I don't know the end product, but I do know I want to explore this Black queer lesbian South more because I think that that's something, I talk about the harm and the hurt, but then I also want to really explore what are the tenets of Black queer lesbian South and what is Black queer joy, in that. So that's what I think I would like to do next. I don't know in what capacity. but something to that effect.
I know you've been talking about a podcast off and on for a few years now, so you may want to reconsider that. I want to thank you all for staying with us. We did go about 10 minutes over our time that we had wanted to, but we don't like to just cut off great conversation. And I'm just gonna, make final statements before I turn it over to our president to close us out. I just want to highlight Dr. Grimm's vision of NCBS, and I want to say that what has happened tonight, as well as when we had Dr. Larry Miles on, um, Dr. Grimm sees NCBS as a place of mentorship, and to have students of a colleague who is now an ancestor, Dr. Josephine Bradley. Now, two of her students have presented here with their first books. These are students that she has taken to conferences, NCBS being one that you had to go to every year. And when we see this type of mentorship from professors, when we see the continued relationship that those students keep with NCBS, even after those professors have retired or transitioned, and they're still becoming the scholars that professors have molded and mentored. This is what Dr. Grimm has said she wants NCBS to be. So I'm honored and grateful that we're able to represent that tonight. And that we are able to let people know that this platform is here for this purpose, and that NCBS will continue doing this work. So thank you so much, Dr. Canty. And Dr. Canty did just put in the chat the discount code to her book. So please make sure you get that. And also Valerie, just saying, we have family members on, Dr. Canty has her mom here, her aunt here. We have colleagues from, around the nation here, and a lot of Clark Atlanta alum. And when we think about NCBS and this family, I just, had to highlight the significance of tonight in relation to Dr. Grimm's vision for NCBS and her strategic plan for what she wants the organization to accomplish. So at this time, Madam President, I turn the floor over to you to close us out for the night.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, Dr. Jamie Canton Williams. It's been great having you here with us tonight. I want to say thank you to everybody who listened in, who asked questions, who was a part of this experience in terms of the subject matter, but just also your time and your presence. We all are a community. I want to end by saying that all things grow from love, even beans. So go out and snap some beans.
Yes.
And get to know some bean snappers.
Yes.
Because we all are one in the human experience, and we need each other. So thank you, Jamie, for bringing the Southern experience to life. And we wish you well on your second book project after you get some rest. And also just keep telling the stories of people whose lives been silent and been hidden for whatever reason they are and were. And to you who are still with us, just have a good evening and thank you. And we look forward to picking up again when we start the fall session. We'll be working over the summer on a number of different ideas. So if you have ideas, feel free, send them to us, and we'll do what we can to make them a part of platforms. And you're welcome at any time to join us. So be well, be safe, and most of all, be loving and kind towards somebody. Good night, and thank you, Alicia.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Canty Williams.
Thank you. Y'all have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for having me.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Me.